Hey guys, Mark Allen, BHSpringSolutions LLC and BHSpringSolutions.com, and we're back for another session of High Power University. And this is one that we've probably prepared for more than any other part of High Power University. And this is really digging as deep as we think we can into the origins of the high power pistol. From what did this high power descend from? The legend is, we've always heard that John Browning started it, Dieudonné Say finished it, or some variation of that. And so we decided to research this subject and study it to the point that we could take an objective look at this whole question and try to connect the dots where we can prove that the dots do connect. And there is a lot of confusion and debate, and you can look on gun forums and see a lot of disagreements and differences of opinion, and a lot is based on what somebody read over here or somebody read over there. And the high power pistol and the explanation of the high power pistol that we've all been given, to a great extent, suffers from two pieces of likely misinformation or disinformation, or not all the information being conveyed. And here's what I mean. Companies like Fabrique Nationale and Browning Arms Company, they have a direct interest in what information they allow out to the public. It affects salability of handguns and their reputation and how things are perceived. And certainly that was, I think, on their mind with the high power pistol, definitely, and for multiple reasons. The other reason is a story that I related in a previous session of High Power University, and I didn't finish it, but here's the story. When I was in school, this was around 8th grade, the teacher asked 6 students to come to the front of the class. 5 of the students left the class, shut the door, could not hear what was being said in the room. And the teacher read a story to the first student, and it was a story about something that happened, and there was quite a bit of detail, and there were some pieces of information that were really important, and some of it was just kind of extra detail. The teacher finished telling the story, and this was probably about a 30-second to 45-second total story. And then she told this to the first student, and then they asked another student to come in the room, which would be student number 2. Student number 1 tells the same story by memory to student number 2. And then the third student comes in and tells the story to the third student. The third student tells the story to the fourth student. And then they get to the 6th student, and that student hears the story from the 5th student, and the 6th student finally tells the story back to the teacher, who then reads the original story. By this time, we're not even on the right side of the world anymore. It's not even the right season. The numbers of people involved in the story, had completely changed to something completely erroneous and different. And to an extent, the history and the evolution of the high power at least appears to us to suffer at some level from that phenomenon, that second-hand information is not as good as first-hand information. And in this case, the first-hand information would really come from the gun manufacturers. And their first-hand information is always going to be a bit suspect, because they have a lot of things to protect, from reputation to salability of their firearms and public opinion, and so it goes. So it at least appears to us at some levels that a lot of the information that we have been assuming and we've been passing around and talking about for a long time about the high power pistol specifically and its origins seem to be partly based in fact in reality, and some of it doesn't seem to be based in fact in reality. And we're going to try, as you're going to see, to connect the dots in a way where we're connecting dots that logically connect. And we're going to stay away from things that would be kind of speculation, or maybe the firearms maker, this was the public line that they conveyed, and without getting into a lot of that stuff. Still to this moment, with respect to the high power pistol, I have no idea who invented the double stack or stagger stack magazine or high capacity magazine. Some people say John Browning did. It was a firearm before the high power, or another inventor. Many say Dieudonné Safe did. What we can say, there was a firearm developed in 1922 that was apparently momentarily called the Model 1922, which actually became the Model 1922 was actually a variant of the 1910 model that was made for Yugoslavia. The Model 1922, as it was called at some points, and then later called the 1927 Grand Rendement, RENDEMENT, which means high capacity, or something of that regard in French. If you Google 1927 Grand Rendement, you will find a couple of images. You will find some references to some articles where it's mentioned kind of in a short paragraph or a one-liner on the way to talking about the modern day high power pistol. So what we discovered, and when we did a search on YouTube, 1927 Grand Rendement Browning, like nothing comes up. And so we decided to explore into this, just because neither Browning or FN apparently decided to ever put this firearm into production, and we think there's some logical reasons why they did not. It does not necessarily mean that John Browning's last design that received a patent, which actually was received a few months after his passing in 1927, in February of 27 is when the patent was generated. That in and of itself warrants that we should take a close look at this handgun, because the stimulus for the design of this handgun was the French military wanting an upgraded sidearm. So we're going to get into that just a little bit, but we want to talk a little bit first and set the stage and the picture. In 1921, when the First World War is over by about 2 years, and France wants a military sidearm. Now, to keep this in context, or to put it into context, this was a real similar time period to some things that we have been seeing in 2020 and the years just prior to now. There was a pandemic in 1918. It killed more American soldiers than the war, and it probably impacted the outcome of World War I. John Browning's firearms designs also played a pivotal role in World War I, and likely changed the course of history. World War I ended in 1919, and this was at the time said to be, around the world, is my understanding, the war to end all wars. And now, we're going to put this into a 2016 context. Donald Trump is elected president, the world's greatest gun salesman retires, and all of my Second Amendment brethren are very happy about Donald Trump being elected, and firearms companies start filing for bankruptcy because the sales of firearms just go off the cliff. Nobody's worried about losing their guns, and nobody's worried anymore about Obama's going to come take my guns. And the fervor and the interest in firearms really entered a depressionary period. And although the economy in the United States seemed to do quite well 2016 through 2019, if you were in the firearms economy in these years, or if you were making firearms and trying to sell them, you were in the great Trump Depression. but because, at least in the United States anyway. So in 1921, they were in somewhat of a this profile, but worldwide. And what I mean by that is World War I has just ended. The countries of the world that were involved in this were making arms and making arms and making arms at the fastest rate they possibly could. And now the war is over. The war to end all wars is over. And you can imagine the impact that would have on the demand for firearms around 1920, around 1921. In other words, the war's over, the pandemic's over, it's time to get back to work. But if you are a firearms designer, or if you are a firearms manufacturer, you could suddenly find yourself at having some lack of things to do, because by this time there's lots and lots and lots of guns, and everybody's got too many guns, and there's no war to fight, so what are we going to do with all these guns? So there was a bigger question about what are we going to do with all these guns that we've made than there was who's going to make the next best new whatever. In fact, it appears that demand in these years for companies like FN and Browning Arms Company and designers like John Browning, not that there was not a demand for John Browning, there absolutely was, but for designers that were not on John Browning's level, which would have been all of them, there was a lack of work. There was a lack of demand, and that's where they were. Because one of my first questions about the high-power pistol was, okay, so, well, why in the world would anybody care what France wants on their firearm, and why would they put something like a magazine disconnect on a pistol like the Browning high power just because the French wanted it? You know, it hits me funny because the French and France does not, it just doesn't hit me as the folks that should be deciding what a good firearm should have in it or not. But that was the request for proposal that France had generated in their search for a new sidearm in the early 20s, and they were one of the only customers that were out there who were soliciting new firearms designs and proposals from firearms manufacturers to supply to them their next military sidearm. So in this context, when you're in this period where there's a general lack of interest in new armament, any country, especially if you're in Belgium and your next door neighbor whose language you also speak is looking for a firearm, well, of course you're going to be chasing that business. And that had a lot to do with how the high power became the handgun it did. It was the business that FN was chasing at the time, because it was some of the only business likely that that was presenting itself in those years. We were into the roaring 20s. We had finished the war to end all wars, and guns were just not what was on a lot of people's minds at this time. There's a correlation and a similarity to the United States gun market for the last 3.5 years that we've experienced. Well, up until COVID started, and we started having a little social unrest in the United States, and then everybody started worrying about, things again. And so the firearms market then was a market that goes up and down, and at the time that John Browning designed what we mostly know as the 1927 Grand Rendement, this was a period where my imagination is John Browning was looking at this like, if I'm going to do this, I really have to hit this out of the park, or I really need to hit this out of the park. He had to design around so many elements of the 1911, for which he had sold the patents to the United States government and or Colt, and so he couldn't use a lot of the 1911 elements of that design, so he had to design around it. And this seems to me to have taken John Browning to a higher level in handgun design that, quite frankly, the world today has still not seen. In studying his patent application, which goes on for 14 pages, 2 pages of the drawings by John Browning of the components of the 1927 Grand Rendement, and 12 more pages of explanation. So why are we going to this effort? In studying this information, what hit me was this is a lot of the missing pieces of the puzzle when we think of the high power and, you know, who really designed this. It's a design that, you know, has kept gunsmiths busy for a couple of reasons. Kind of a non-John Browning-esque trigger pull out of the box, which is what the Browning high power unfortunately was famous for so long. But there's a lot of information that when you go online and you start researching John Browning, Dia Done Save, when you start reading a lot about the high power pistol, you read things like this. This is about the high power design itself and John Browning's, you know, starting the pistol is what a lot of people think. We can only assume that John Browning had too many other irons in the fire at the time to flesh out this great pistol before he passed on. That is absolutely patently not true. Another one, and this is in the September 2020 American Rifleman from the NRA. There's a really nice article by Daniel McElreath in there, and I'm not picking on Daniel whatsoever, but there's a point in here where he writes about the high power pistol. He says Browning started by creating a staggered double column magazine that held 16 rounds, unheard of for a flush fitting unit. This is a point of nobody knows. Some people say he created a 15 round magazine, some people say he created a 16 round magazine. There is no evidence that what John Browning designed was even for a 9mm at all. In fact, there's a lot of evidence that says that he developed this 1927 Grand Rendement for a cartridge that is a 7.65 by 20 millimeters, or you would also think of it as a 32 long, but Longue, I think, using the French spelling is the most popular. This was really what was on, I think, France's mind to a point, because the actual pistol that they wound up choosing was that cartridge. That cartridge that I'm talking about, if you look it up, you'll find out that was actually kind of one of these top secret cartridges that was ammunition cartridges that was in development by the U.S. government during World War I. John Browning actually developed a firearm for that cartridge, and all of that never played out before World War I ended. But this ammunition caliber that had been developed, that was somewhat kind of top secret, this was kind of the in vogue kind of thing at the time, because it was something that had been in development, that was going to be used, I believe, in a rifle, but wound up being transferable into a handgun. So there's a lot of evidence that John Browning did not even developed the 1927 Grand Rendement with the 9mm cartridge or caliber even in mind. It says, as development progressed, Browning conceived of the basic shape of the pistol and its breech locking system, in which the rear of the barrel cammed down to disengage dorsal lugs from recesses in the slide. Absolutely accurate. Working with an FN design team that included SAVE. And this is where things start to go a little bit not true. Browning ultimately produced a pistol called the Model 1927 Grand Rendement. At the time he produced it, it was not called that. It was 1922 then. However, Browning passed away in 1926 at FN in Erstal, still awaiting the pistol's patent, which was not issued until the next year. That part's true. Despite Browning and FN's efforts, The grand rendement was found wanting. I don't think that's exactly true. It was considered to be too large and heavy for its intended purpose. It fell to Dieudonné Save to rework the design and produce a gun that satisfied the desires of the military. This appears, based on what we can read in the patent paperwork and what we know of what France was wanting at the time, this was not a design that was found wanting. If anything, this was a design that was about 100 years ahead of its time, at least. So we're going to break into that next time in the next session of High Power University, and all about the 1927 Grand Rendement and its evolution to the modern day high power pistol. I'm Mark Allen, BHSpringSolutions LLC and BHSpringSolutions.com.